Formula One champion Lewis Hamilton just wanted a quiet coffee during a rare break between races. Returning to his hometown of Stevenage, he ducked into a racing-themed coffee shop called Victory Lane, hoping to blend in unnoticed. But when he looked up to place his order, something about the silver-haired barista's kind eyes seemed strangely familiar. Neither could have predicted how this chance encounter would change both their lives, revealing that some connections are destined to last a lifetime, even when the road between meetings spans decades and continents. What begins as a simple coffee stop becomes a journey of rediscovery. As Lewis finds his primary school teacher who once helped a struggling boy with dyslexia believe in himself, long before he became a 7-time world champion. Lewis Hamilton yawned as he pulled the curtains open in his childhood bedroom. The morning sun poured in, warming his face. It felt strange to wake up in Stevenage after spending so many nights in luxury hotels around the world. 3 days, he mumbled to himself. 3 days of peace and quiet. Lewis had just finished the Spanish Grand Prix at Circuit de Barcelona, Catalunya. It had been a tough race. The hot track and tight corners had tested even his legendary tire management skills. He finished second behind Max Verstappen, which wasn't bad, but Lewis always wanted to win. His phone buzzed. Another message from Toto Wolff, his team boss at Mercedes. Something about car adjustments for the next race. Lewis put the phone down without answering. That could wait. For now, he just wanted to be Lewis from Stevenage, not Lewis Hamilton, 7-time Formula One world champion. Lewis pulled on a plain black t-shirt, jeans, and a baseball cap. He checked himself in the mirror. Perfect. Most people wouldn't look twice at him dressed like this. "Going out, darling?" his mom called from downstairs. "Just for a walk and maybe some coffee," Lewis replied, trotting down the stairs. "Need to clear my head," his mom smiled knowingly. "No security today?" Lewis shook his head. "Not today. I just want to feel normal for a few hours." "Well, be careful. More people might recognize you than you think." Lewis gave her a quick hug. "I'll be fine. I'll bring you back something sweet." The morning air felt crisp and clean as Lewis walked down the familiar streets of his hometown. Stevenage wasn't fancy, like Monaco where he now lived, but it was real. The concrete paths and brick buildings told the story of a working-class town where people like his dad, Anthony, worked multiple jobs to make ends meet. Lewis turned down a side street, avoiding the main shopping area where he might be spotted. His mind wandered to the upcoming race calendar. After this short break, he'd be back on the road. Austria, Silverstone, Hungary, Belgium. The season never really stopped. Maybe I should just enjoy this moment, he thought, looking up at the blue sky. No press conferences, no engineers asking for feedback, no rival teams watching his every move. As Lewis rounded the corner, something caught his eye. A new shop with a checkered flag painted on its sign. "Victory Lane," it said in racing-style letters. The windows had small displays of racing memorabilia, miniature helmets, toy cars, and what looked like signed photos. "That's new," Lewis thought, slowing his pace. The shop hadn't been there during his last visit home. His curiosity piqued when he noticed it was a coffee shop. The smell of freshly ground beans drifted through the door as a customer exited. Lewis's stomach rumbled, reminding him he hadn't eaten breakfast yet. "Why not?" he said to himself, adjusting his cap lower over his eyes. Lewis pushed open the door and stepped inside. The interior was even more racing-focused than the outside suggested. The walls were covered with framed photos of famous racing moments. He spotted Ayrton Senna, his childhood hero, in several of them. There were also display cases with racing gloves, pieces of carbon fiber from crashed cars, and other memorabilia. But what made Lewis smile was that it wasn't just Formula One. There were karting photos, too. Kids racing at local tracks, their faces full of the same joy he had felt at their age. The shop was quiet, with only a few tables occupied. An older couple sat by the window, deeply focused on their crossword puzzle. A young man with headphones typed away on a laptop. No one looked up when Lewis entered. The menu board behind the counter listed drinks with racing-inspired names. Monza, Mocha, Silverstone Smoothie, Monaco Grand Prix, apparently a special blend with a hint of hazelnut. Lewis pulled out his phone while waiting in line, checking his messages. His physio had sent his training schedule for next week. His assistant had questions about upcoming sponsorship events. His father had sent a simple text. "Hope you're getting some rest, son. Proud of you." That last message made Lewis smile. After all these years, after all the success, his dad's approval still meant everything. When it was his turn to order, Lewis kept his head down, still scrolling through his phone. "I'll have a Monaco Grand Prix, please," he said, not looking up. "Size?" asked a warm female voice. "Large, no sugar," Lewis replied, finally lifting his gaze to pay. His eyes met those of the woman behind the counter. She was in her 60s, with silver-streaked hair tied back in a neat bun. She wore a black apron with the Victory Lane logo over a simple blue blouse. Something about her eyes made Lewis pause. They were kind and intelligent, with small wrinkles at the corners that suggested she smiled often. There was something familiar about them, something that tugged at a distant memory. The woman didn't react to his face. She simply smiled and rang up his order. "That'll be 4.25, please," she said, holding out her hand for his payment. As Lewis handed over a £5 note, he wondered why this stranger seemed so familiar. The feeling nagged at him as he moved to the side to wait for his drink. "1 Monaco Grand Prix 4. She paused, waiting for a name for the cup. "Lewis," he said simply. She wrote it on the cup without a flicker of recognition. "Coming right up, Lewis," she said with a smile that warmed him more than any coffee could. "Coming right up, Lewis," she said with a smile that warmed him more than any coffee could. Lewis found a quiet corner table and sat down, his back to most of the other customers. Through the window, he could see the streets of Stevenage stretching before him. It wasn't a glamorous town like many people expected. No ancient castles or cobblestone streets. Just a practical, working-class place where families like his had made their lives. Stevenage was one of the first new towns built after World War II. The government created it to house Londoners who had lost their homes during the bombing. That practical beginning showed in its design, organized neighborhoods, plenty of roundabouts, and sensible concrete buildings. Not beautiful, maybe, but solid and dependable. Lewis watched people hurry past the window. Did any of them know a world champion had grown up on these streets? Probably. His face was on billboards and television screens across the globe now. But when he was a child riding his bike through these same streets, he was just another kid with big dreams. He remembered pedaling through Fairlands Valley Park, pretending his bike was a racing car. The 120-acre park was the green heart of Stevenage, with its artificial lakes and open spaces. Lewis and his dad spent countless weekends there. While other kids played football or flew kites, Lewis was always racing something. His bike, his scooter, his own 2 feet. "Your Monaco Grand Prix," said the barista, placing his coffee on the table. "Thank you," Lewis replied, looking up at her again. That nagging feeling of familiarity returned. She gave him another smile before returning to the counter. Lewis sipped his coffee and let his mind wander back through the years. He'd been just 6 years old when his dad bought him his first go-kart. It wasn't new or fancy. Anthony Hamilton couldn't afford that on his multiple jobs, including putting in time as a British rail worker and extra hours as an IT manager. Sometimes, he worked as many as 4 jobs at once, all to support Lewis's racing. "If you're going to do something, do it 100%, his dad always said. Lewis remembered the frozen winter mornings, his dad warming the cart's engine with a hairdryer before races, the long drives to karting tracks across the country, the missed social events because every spare penny went to racing. His journey had started right here, but it had taken him so far away. From Pear Tree Junior School to the winner's podium at Monaco. From being the only black kid on the karting circuit to becoming the first black driver in Formula One. Lewis took another sip of his coffee, surprised by how good it tasted. The hazelnut flavor was subtle, not overwhelming like at some chain coffee shops. His gaze drifted to a framed newspaper article on the wall. It showed a young boy lifting a karting trophy. Not him, but the joy on the boy's face was familiar. Lewis had felt that same pure happiness when racing karts, before the politics, the pressure, and the fame complicated everything. He'd won his first British karting championship at 10. By 13, he'd signed with McLaren's Young Driver program. Ron Dennis, McLaren's boss, had taken a chance on him after Lewis boldly introduced himself at an awards ceremony, saying, "I'm going to race for you one day." Lewis smiled at the memory. The confidence of youth was something special. His time at Pear Tree Junior School felt like another life now. He hadn't been the best student. His dyslexia made reading and writing difficult. But he'd been determined, just like on the track. Stevenage had shaped him in ways he was still discovering. Growing up as a mixed-race kid in a predominantly white town hadn't always been easy. There were bullies, of course, kids who said he didn't belong, teachers who underestimated him, but there were others who had seen something in him. Teachers who had stayed after school to help him with his reading. Friends who didn't care about the color of his skin, only how fast he could run or how good he was at PlayStation games. Lewis checked his watch. He'd been sitting there for 20 minutes, lost in memories. His coffee was half empty and cooling rapidly. A group of teenagers entered the shop, their loud voices breaking his train of thought. One of them glanced his way, then did a double take. Lewis saw the recognition dawn on the boy's face. "No way," the teen said under his breath, nudging his friend. Lewis gave them a small nod, but quickly turned his attention back to his phone. He wasn't ready for selfies and autographs today. To his surprise, the teens seemed to understand. They ordered their drinks and took a table on the other side of the shop, occasionally stealing glances his way, but respecting his privacy. "Refill?" asked the silver-haired barista, appearing beside his table. "Yes, please," Lewis said, looking up at her again. This time, he noticed a small pin on her apron. It was slightly faded with age, but he could make out the outline of a pear tree, the logo of Pear Tree Junior School. Lewis's heartbeat quickened. Could this woman have been a teacher there? During his time, or perhaps later? Is that why she seemed familiar? "I like what you've done with this place," Lewis said, gesturing around the shop. "The racing theme is cool." "Thank you," she replied. "My son's idea, actually. He's been mad about racing since he was small." She glanced at the teens who were still stealing looks at Lewis. "Like most young people around here, since you put Stevenage on the map." There was a hint of pride in her voice when she said this, but still no sign that she recognized him as anything more than a customer named Lewis. "I grew up here too," Lewis said casually, watching her face for any reaction. "Did you? It's a good place to raise a family," she said. "Not exciting, mind you, but solid." Lewis nodded. "Solid is a good word for it." As she walked away to get his refill, Lewis found himself strangely eager for her return. There was something about this woman that pulled at his memories, like a familiar song he couldn't quite name. As the barista walked away, Louis took a moment to study Victory Lane more closely. The coffee shop had a welcoming feel despite its racing theme. Most racing spaces were loud and flashy, full of bright colors and dramatic photos of crashes or celebrations. But this place was different. The racing photos on the walls were carefully chosen to show the beauty of the sport. There were stunning aerial shots of tracks curving through landscapes, close-ups of drivers focused in their cockpits, and joyful images of team celebrations. Someone had selected these with a deep understanding of what made racing special. Louis noticed a display case near the counter. It held a collection of small racing helmets, not expensive replicas, but the kind of toys a child might collect. They were arranged by year, from the simple designs of the 1970s to the complex patterns of today. "Here's your refill," said the barista, placing a fresh cup on his table. "On the house." "Thank you," Louis said, surprised. "That's very kind." "We like to treat our customers well," she replied, "especially the quiet ones who don't make a fuss." She glanced meaningfully at the teens who were still stealing looks at him. Louis smiled. "I appreciate that. Enjoy," she said, turning to go. "Wait," Louis said, making a quick decision. "Can I ask something?" She paused. "Of course." "That pin on your apron, is that from Peartree Junior School?" The barista touched the small pin and smiled. "Good eye." "Yes, it is. I was a teacher there for many years." Louis's heart beat faster. "I went there as a kid. Late 80s, early 90s. Something flickered in her eyes. A moment of calculation, perhaps trying to place him in time. "I started teaching there in 1985, she said. "So our paths might have crossed." Louis nodded, trying to keep his voice casual. "They probably did. I would have been there from 89 to 95. The barista looked at him more carefully now, her head tilting slightly as if seeing him from a new angle. "I'm sorry if I don't remember you specifically," she said. "I taught hundreds of children over the years." "No need to apologize," Louis assured her. "It was a long time ago." A customer called from the counter, and the barista excused herself. Louis watched her go, his mind racing faster than any car he'd ever driven. He was now certain she had been a teacher during his time at Peartree. But which one? He tried to picture his primary school teachers. There was Mr. Reynolds, the stern math teacher with the bushy mustache. Mrs. Cooper, who taught art and always had paint on her clothes. Mr. Thompson, the sports teacher who had encouraged Louis's competitive spirit. And then there was Ms. Sullivan. The memory clicked into place like the final piece of a puzzle. Ms. Sullivan had been his favorite teacher. She'd worked with students who needed extra help, particularly those with dyslexia like Louis. She had never made him feel slow or different. Instead, she'd shown him different ways to learn, to work around the jumbled letters that frustrated him so much. Louis looked at the barista again as she helped another customer. Could it really be Ms. Sullivan? The timing fit. The Peartree pin made sense, and there was something about her patient manner that felt familiar. But surely she would have recognized him. His face was on television, in magazines, on billboards. He was one of the most famous British athletes in the world, unless she wasn't a Formula One fan. Not everyone followed the sport, even in a country as racing-mad as Britain. Louis drank his coffee slowly, debating what to do. Should he introduce himself properly? Ask her directly if she was Ms. Sullivan? What if he was wrong and made a fool of himself? He was used to making split-second decisions at 200 miles per hour, But somehow this felt more difficult. A small commotion at the door drew his attention. A delivery person had arrived with boxes of supplies, and the barista was helping to carry them behind the counter. Louis watched as she organized the staff with quiet efficiency, just as Ms. Sullivan had organized her classroom. That settled it. He needed to know. Louis finished his coffee and approached the counter. The barista was entering something into the cash register and didn't notice him immediately. "Excuse me," Louis said gently. She looked up and smiled. "Yes? Did you need something else?" "I was wondering," Louis began, then paused. How exactly should he ask this? "Your name wouldn't happen to be Sullivan, would it?" Her eyes widened slightly. "As a matter of fact, it is. Margaret Sullivan." She studied his face more intently now. "Did we know each other? I'm sorry, but I meet so many people in this job." "We did," Louis said, his voice suddenly thick with emotion. "A long time ago, at Pear Tree Junior School." Ms. Sullivan looked at him with new interest, trying to place his face among the thousands of children she had taught over the years. "Louis," he said, pointing to the name she had written on his cup. "Louis Hamilton." "Louis," he said, pointing to the name she had written on his cup. "Louis Hamilton." Ms. Sullivan's face remained calm, but her eyes narrowed slightly as she studied him more carefully. "Louis Hamilton," she repeated slowly. Then she shook her head with a small smile. "I'm sorry, but I have trouble connecting faces from 25 years ago to the adults they've become. Were you in my reading group?" Louis felt a strange mix of disappointment and relief. She remembered teaching him, but didn't recognize him as the famous racing driver. "I was," he confirmed. "You helped me with my dyslexia." Something sparked in her eyes. "Ah, yes. You were the boy who always had racing magazines instead of books. You'd make any deal to read about cars instead of our assigned stories." Louis laughed. "That sounds like me." "Well, it's lovely to see a former student," she said warmly. "What do you do now, Louis?" The question caught him off guard. Was it possible she truly didn't know? Louis Hamilton wasn't just a racing driver. He was one of the most successful Formula One drivers of all time. His face appeared on advertisements around the world. He had millions of followers on social media. I'm a racing driver," he said simply. "Are you really?" Ms. Sullivan's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "How wonderful! So you followed your dream after all." Before Louis could respond, a customer called for service, and Ms. Sullivan held up a finger. "Give me a moment, Louis. Let's chat properly. When I'm free." As she turned away, Louis went back to his seat, his mind spinning. It seemed impossible that she didn't recognize him, yet her reaction had been too genuine to be fake. Louis checked his phone, finding several messages from his assistant about appearances he needed to make at the British Grand Prix next month. The world of private jets, champagne celebrations, and million-dollar contracts felt very far away from this small coffee shop in Stevenage. He watched Ms. Sullivan work, noticing the way she moved with purpose and smiled with kindness at each customer. She was older now, of course. Her hair had turned silver, and lines had formed at the corners of her eyes. But her manner was exactly as he remembered: patient, attentive, and genuinely interested in people. Louis's mind drifted back to his school days at Pear Tree. He hadn't been the best student. The words would jump and switch places on the page when he tried to read. Spelling tests were torture. Some teachers thought he wasn't trying hard enough or wasn't smart enough, but not Ms. Sullivan. She had shown him that there were different ways to learn. She'd let him stand or move around when he needed to. She'd given him colored overlays for his books that somehow made the letters stay in place. Most importantly, she'd never made him feel stupid. "Everybody's brain works differently," she had told him. Your brain is built for speed, Lewis. You see patterns and possibilities faster than anyone else. We just need to help you with the reading part. Lewis remembered one particular day when he'd failed a spelling test badly. The other kids had laughed. He'd been so upset that he'd hidden in the bathroom during lunch. His Sullivan had found him there and sat on the floor beside him, not caring about her neat skirt. "Did you know that Albert Einstein couldn't read until he was 9?" she'd asked him. "And he changed how we understand the whole universe." "Really?" young Lewis had asked through his tears. "Really," she'd confirmed. "And Richard Branson, who owns his own airline and record company? He has dyslexia too. Having a different kind of brain isn't a weakness, Lewis. It can be your greatest strength." Those words had stayed with him through every challenge, every setback, every time someone told him he couldn't do something because of who he was or where he came from. A young boy approached the counter with a racing magazine, pointing excitedly at something inside. Ms. Sullivan bent down to his level, listening carefully to whatever he was explaining. Lewis couldn't hear their words, but he recognized her expression. The same attentive look she'd given him when he'd rambled about Michael Schumacher's latest win, or Ayrton Senna's incredible qualifying lap. She still didn't seem to recognize Lewis as the famous person he'd become. Was it possible she didn't follow Formula One? Or perhaps she simply couldn't connect the small boy from her classroom with the man sitting in her coffee shop? Lewis wasn't sure why, but he felt no rush to correct her misunderstanding. It was refreshing to have someone see him as just Lewis, former student, rather than Lewis Hamilton, celebrity. And Sullivan finished with the young boy and caught Lewis's eye, pointing to the clock and holding up 5 fingers. She'd talk to him in 5 minutes. Lewis nodded and settled back in his chair, a strange calm washing over him. For the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The racing world could wait. The sponsors could wait. The media could wait. Right. Now, he was just a boy from Stevenage who wanted to talk to his favorite teacher. Lewis's phone buzzed in his pocket. Then it buzzed again, and again. With a sigh, he pulled it out to check what couldn't wait. 3 new messages from Toto Wolff, the head of Mercedes Formula One team. "Lewis, we need to discuss the car setup for Austria. The engineers have some ideas for the rear wing. Call me when you can." 2 messages from his race engineer, Bono. "Hope you're resting. Quick question about the brake balance from Spain." 1 from his personal trainer. "Don't forget your cardio tomorrow. I've adjusted your program based on the heat expected at the next race." This was Lewis's life now. A constant stream of decisions, feedback, and commitments. Every detail mattered when racing at the highest level of motorsport. A millimeter difference in wing angle, a fraction of a second in reaction time, the exact composition of rubber in his tires. Lewis had just competed in the Spanish Grand Prix at Barcelona, finishing second to Max Verstappen. The Dutch driver was his biggest rival these days, young and hungry, pushing Lewis to his limits every race weekend. The championship was close this year. Lewis had won 3 races so far: Bahrain, Portugal, and Monaco. Max had won 3 as well: Imola, Spain, and Azerbaijan. The battle would likely continue all season, with neither driver giving an inch. Lewis put his phone on silent and slipped it back into his pocket. The racing world could wait for an hour. Right now, something more important had his attention. Ms. Sullivan was finishing up with a customer, smiling as she handed over a paper bag with what looked like freshly baked cookies inside. Lewis noticed how everyone seemed to leave her counter a little happier than when they arrived. His phone buzzed again, this time with a text from his father. "How's your visit home going? Mom says you went for a walk. Everything okay? Lewis smiled and typed a quick reply. All good. Found a nice coffee shop. Actually ran into Ms. Sullivan from Peartree. She owns the place. 3 dots appeared as his father typed a response. Margaret Sullivan? Your reading teacher? That's amazing. Tell her Anthony says hello. She was one of the few who always believed in you. Lewis felt a warm glow at his father's message. Anthony Hamilton had been his rock, his manager, his mechanic, and his biggest supporter all rolled into one. Their relationship had faced challenges over the years, especially when Lewis decided to end their professional relationship and manage his own career. But they had worked through the rough patches, and the bond between them was stronger than ever now. Lewis looked around the coffee shop, thinking about how different his life was from what Ms. Sullivan must imagine. He now lived primarily in Monaco, though he had homes in London, New York, and Colorado as well. He traveled the world for races and appearances. His friends included musicians, actors, fashion designers, and fellow athletes. He had used his platform to speak out about issues that mattered to him. After the death of George Floyd in 2020, Lewis had become a powerful voice for racial justice in Formula One and beyond. He had pushed his sport to acknowledge its lack of diversity and to make real changes. He had launched the Hamilton Commission to improve black representation in UK motorsport. Lewis had also embraced environmental causes, adopting a plant-based diet and speaking out about climate change. He had sold his private jet to reduce his carbon footprint. He had invested in vegan restaurants and sustainable fashion. These were the things that gave his racing meaning now. Winning was still important. The competitive fire still burned, bright. But Lewis knew there was more to life than trophies. Sorry to keep you waiting, Ms. Sullivan said, appearing at his table with a fresh cup of coffee. On the house, again. You don't have to do that, Lewis protested. Nonsense. It's not every day I get to catch up with a former student. She sat down across from him, looking genuinely interested. So, racing driver. That's exciting. What kind of racing do you do? Lewis hesitated. Should he tell her the truth? Would she believe him? Formula One, he said simply. Ms. Sullivan's eyebrows rose. Goodness, that's the very top, isn't it? How wonderful! There was still no flash of recognition in her eyes. She clearly didn't follow the sport closely enough to connect him to his public image. I've been doing it for a while now, Lewis said, finding it oddly refreshing to understate his accomplishments. I drive for Mercedes. Well, that sounds very professional, she said, clearly impressed, but still not making the connection. I remember you drawing race cars in class when you should have been practicing your spelling. She laughed warmly. I'd say the doodles paid off. Lewis couldn't help but smile. They did, I suppose. Is your father still involved? He was so dedicated to your racing. Came to every school event, despite working all those jobs. He is, Lewis nodded. Not as my manager anymore, but he still comes to races when he can. He actually just texted me to say hello to you. Anthony Hamilton? He said you were one of the few who always believed in me. Ms. Sullivan's eyes lit up. Anthony! Of course I remember him. Such a determined man. Between you and me, some of the other teachers thought he was pushing you too hard with all that racing. But I could see it wasn't just his dream. It was yours, too. Lewis felt a lump form in his throat. It was. It still is. And now you're in Formula One, she said, with genuine pride. I always tell my current students that they should dream big. I'll have to add you to my list of examples. Lewis was about to respond when his phone began to ring. He glanced down to see Toto's name on the screen. I'm sorry. I should probably take this, he said apologetically. Of course, Ms. Sullivan stood up. Don't let me keep you from your work. It was lovely to see you, Lewis. As she walked away, Lewis answered the call, his mind still processing this unexpected collision of his past and present. Toto, hi, he said. Sorry, I've been a bit busy this morning. Toto, hi, he said. Sorry, I've been a bit busy this morning. Lewis, no problem. Toto's Austrian accent came through clearly. The engineers want your feedback on the new front wing design. We need to decide today if we're going to use it for Austria. Can we discuss it later? Lewis asked, watching Ms. Sullivan help another customer. I'm in the middle of something important. There was a pause on the other end. It wasn't like Lewis to delay team matters. Of course, Toto finally said. Everything okay? Everything's great, actually, Lewis replied. I'll call you in a couple of hours. Lewis ended the call and stared at his empty coffee cup. The conversation with Ms. Sullivan had ended too quickly. There was so much more he wanted to say, to ask her. Why hadn't he told her who he really was? 7-time world champion, the most successful Formula One driver in history, Knight of the British Empire, Sir Lewis Hamilton. Maybe because, for a few precious minutes, he'd been just Lewis again. The boy with dreams bigger than his circumstances, the kid who struggled with reading but could drive a cart faster than anyone else. Lewis watched as Ms. Sullivan moved around behind the counter, occasionally glancing his way with a kind smile. He felt an unusual nervousness, like before his first-ever Formula One race in Australia, back in 2007. Should he go up and tell her? Would she think he'd been playing some kind of trick on her? He'd faced the pressure of championship-deciding races. He'd made split-second decisions at 200 miles per hour. Why was this so difficult? Lewis finished his coffee but remained seated. He pulled out his phone and pretended to be busy, stealing glances at Ms. Sullivan as she worked. He noticed more details about the shop now. The display of racing helmets included a miniature version of his own distinctive yellow design from his early Mercedes days. There was even a framed newspaper clipping about his first world championship in 2008, won by a single point in the final corners of the final race in Brazil. How could she have these items and not recognize him? Lewis ordered another coffee as an excuse to stay longer. When Ms. Sullivan brought it over, he gathered his courage. So, Victory Lane is a great name for a coffee shop, he said. Very racing-themed. My son's idea, she explained with a smile. He's the Formula One fan. Watches every race, knows all the statistics. He's at a conference this week, actually. He'd be thrilled to know a real F1 driver visited. That explained it. Her son was the racing enthusiast, not her. Do you follow the sport at all? Lewis asked cautiously. Only through my son's excitement, she admitted. I know the big names, of course. Schumacher, Vettel, Hamilton. She said his surname without a flicker of recognition, despite looking right at him. Hamilton? Lewis repeated, his heart racing. Yes, Lewis Hamilton. He's the champion now, I believe. My son never stops talking about him. She laughed. Apparently, he's from Stevenage, too. The local hero. Lewis nearly choked on his coffee. Funny thing is, Miss Sullivan continued, tilting her head as she studied him. You even share the same first name. Was she figuring it out? Lewis wondered what to say next. That's when he noticed the pin on her apron again. The Pear Tree Jr. school logo was unmistakable. But there was something else about it that caught his eye. The pin was worn around the edges, clearly old. She had kept it all these years. Lewis made a decision. He wouldn't correct her misunderstanding. Not yet. He wasn't ready for the dynamic to change, for the warmth in her eyes to be replaced by the awe or awkwardness he so often encountered. "What's your son's name?" Lewis asked instead. "Daniel," she answered. "He's an engineer for a racing team in the lower divisions. Dreams of Formula One someday." "That's amazing," Lewis said sincerely. "He was inspired by Lewis Hamilton, actually," she continued. "A local boy making it to the top of the world. It showed him anything is possible." There was such genuine pride in her voice that Lewis felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I should let you get back to work," he said, standing up. "But I'd like to come back tomorrow, if that's okay. There's something I'd like to talk to you about." Ms. Sullivan looked intrigued. "Of course, Lewis. We open at 8. As he left the shop, Lewis knew he needed time to figure out how to tell her the truth. Because somehow, impossibly, his primary school teacher had no idea that the Lewis who had struggled with reading in her classroom was now the Lewis whose name she had just spoken. The next morning, Lewis woke early. He'd hardly slept, his mind replaying the strange conversation with Ms. Sullivan. How had she not recognized him? His face was on billboards, television, and magazines around the world. Yet somehow, the connection hadn't clicked. He dressed casually. Again, jeans, a simple black t-shirt, and the same cap as yesterday. As he headed downstairs, his mother looked up from her morning tea. "You're up early," she noted. "Going back to that coffee shop?" Lewis paused. "How did you know?" She smiled knowingly. "Your father told me you ran into Margaret Sullivan. She was one of the few teachers who saw your potential, not just your problems. You remember her?" "Of course I do. She called us in for a meeting once, and we thought it was going to be another complaint about your attention span." His mother's eyes softened at the memory. "Instead, she told us you had one of the most focused minds she'd ever seen. You just needed the right channel for it." Lewis felt a wave of warmth. "She didn't recognize me, Mum. She knows I'm Lewis Hamilton, her former student. But she doesn't realize I'm the Lewis Hamilton." His mother chuckled. "Margaret never followed sports much. Her focus was always on her students. Her son's the racing fan. He has my merchandise in the shop, but he's away at a conference." "Are you going to tell her?" Lewis hesitated. "I think so. Today." 20 minutes later, Lewis was pushing open the door to Victory Lane again. The morning rush was in full swing, with a line of customers waiting for their caffeine fix before work. Ms. Sullivan was behind the counter, efficiently taking orders while 2 younger staff members prepared the drinks. Lewis joined the line, using the time to study the shop in more detail. In daylight, he could see that one wall held a timeline of Formula One world champions. His own name appeared 7 times, alongside small photos. How had she not made the connection? When he reached the front of the line, Ms. Sullivan's face lit up with recognition. "Lewis, good morning," she said warmly. "Same as yesterday?" "Yes, please," he nodded. "It's busy today." "Morning rush," she explained, writing his name on a cup. "It'll quiet down soon. Are you staying for a while?" "If that's okay." "Of course. I'm looking forward to our chat." She gestured to his usual corner table, which was empty despite the crowd. "I've been saving your spot." The simple kindness touched him. Lewis made his way to the table and waited for the shop to empty. He watched Ms. Sullivan with new appreciation, noticing how she remembered regular customers' orders and asked about their families or jobs. She created a sense of community in this space, just as she had in her classroom years ago. Finally, the rush subsided. Ms. Sullivan approached his table, carrying a fresh coffee and what looked like a homemade muffin. "On the house," she said, placing them before him. "You seemed deep in thought." "Thank you," Lewis said. "I was actually thinking about how you create the same feeling here that you did in your classroom." She looked pleased as she sat down across from him. That's a lovely thing to say. It's true. You made school feel safe for me, even when learning was difficult. You had such determination, she recalled. Even then, most children with your level of dyslexia would have given up on reading. But not you. You just found different ways to get the information you needed. Racing magazines, Lewis smiled. Exactly. I remember bending some school rules to let you use them for reading practice. She laughed softly. My colleagues thought I was too lenient, but I knew you were absorbing every word, every number. Lewis took a deep breath. Ms. Sullivan, there's something I wanted to talk to you about. Please, call me Margaret. You're not 8 years old anymore? Margaret, Lewis corrected himself, the name feeling strange on his tongue. I was wondering, how long have you lived in Stevenage? All my life, she answered. Born and raised, just like you. Left only for university, then came right back to teach. And the coffee shop? Is this a new venture? Fairly new. I retired from teaching 5 years ago, but found I missed connecting with people. My son Daniel suggested the racing theme, given Stevenage's connection to motorsport. She glanced around proudly. We opened 2 years ago. Lewis nodded, formulating his next question carefully. Have you followed my racing career at all? Ms. Sullivan looked apologetic. I'm afraid not in detail. I know you're in Formula One, which is incredible, but I've never been one for sports. I'm sorry to say. No need to apologize, Lewis assured her. I was just curious. Daniel follows every race, though. He says you're with Mercedes? Yes, I've been with them since 2013. That's wonderful stability in such a competitive field, she said, clearly impressed, but still not making the connection Lewis was hinting at. Lewis decided to be more direct. The Lewis Hamilton, your son, talks about the one from Stevenage. Yes, she encouraged when he trailed off. Have you ever seen pictures of him? In newspapers or on television? Ms. Sullivan looked thoughtful. Well, I suppose I must have. Daniel has posters and such. At home. Why do you ask? Lewis held her gaze steadily. Because that Lewis Hamilton and I share more than just a name. She looked confused for a moment, then her eyes widened slightly. What are you saying? I'm saying, Lewis said gently, that I'm that. Lewis Hamilton, the one from Stevenage who drives for Mercedes. The one your son has posters of. Miss Sullivan stared at him, her expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and then dawning realization. But that would mean, she stammered, looking at him more carefully now. You're the Lewis Hamilton? The champion? But that would mean, she stammered, looking at him more carefully now. You're the Lewis Hamilton? The champion? Lewis nodded, feeling strangely vulnerable. Yes, that's me. Ms. Sullivan's hand flew to her mouth. Oh my goodness! She stared at him with new eyes, scanning his features. How did I not see it? You're right there on our wall. To be fair, Lewis said with a gentle smile, I do look a bit different than I did at 8 years old. But still, I should have. She shook her head in disbelief. Lewis Hamilton. Sir Lewis Hamilton, actually. A look of horror crossed her face. And I've been treating you like any regular customer. That's exactly why I didn't say anything yesterday, Lewis admitted. It was nice to be treated normally. Ms. Sullivan seemed to be processing this revelation, her eyes darting between Lewis and the photos of him on the wall. 7 world championships, she murmured. I taught a 7-time world champion. You did more than teach me, Lewis said quietly. You believed in me when others didn't. She met his eyes, her initial shock giving way to professional curiosity. Your dyslexia. Did you ever overcome it? It was such a teacher question that Lewis had to smile. Even now, her first thought was about his learning. You don't overcome dyslexia, he explained. You learn to work with it. I still struggle with reading sometimes, especially when I'm tired. But I've developed strategies. Ms. Sullivan nodded with understanding. What helped you the most? Lewis thought for a moment. The techniques you taught me, actually. Breaking words into smaller chunks, using different colored overlays for documents. And audiobooks have been a game changer. And in your profession, does it affect your racing? Not really, Lewis said. Racing is about instinct, feel, and visual processing. Those are all strengths for me. If anything, dyslexia might have helped me process visual information differently. On the track, Ms. Sullivan beamed with professional satisfaction. I always told the other teachers that your different way of thinking would be an advantage someday. A comfortable silence fell between them. Lewis could see her mind working, likely trying to reconcile the small boy from her classroom with the global sports star sitting across from her. I have to ask, she said finally. Why didn't you tell me right away? Yesterday, when I clearly had no idea who you were. Lewis considered his answer carefully. At first, I was just surprised you didn't recognize me. Then, when I realized you truly didn't know, I found it refreshing. Most people see the Lewis Hamilton they've created in their minds, based on what they've read or heard. You were just seeing me. She nodded thoughtfully. I understand. Fame must make authentic connections difficult. It does, Lewis admitted, but it's more than that. When I walked in here, I was just looking for a quiet coffee. Then I saw you, and suddenly I was that kid in your classroom again. It brought back so many memories. Ms. Sullivan's eyes softened. Good memories, I hope. The best, Lewis assured her. You were one of the few teachers who never made me feel less than. She looked down at her hands, seemingly embarrassed by the praise. I was just doing my job. No, Lewis said firmly. You went above and beyond. Do you know how rare it is for a teacher to tell a kid with learning differences that they might be special because of those differences, not despite them? Ms. Sullivan appeared genuinely moved. I said that? You did. You told me Einstein couldn't read until he was 9, that Richard Branson had dyslexia too. You made me feel like I was in good company, not failing somehow. I remember now, she said softly. You were crying after a spelling test. Lewis nodded. The other kids had laughed. Ms. Sullivan's face clouded with old anger. Children can be cruel without meaning to be. But you made it better, Lewis said. Simply. She looked at him with open curiosity now. And after all your success, all you've achieved, are you happy, Lewis? The question caught him off guard. It wasn't about his career or his fame or his wealth. It was the kind of question a teacher asks because they care about the whole person, not just their achievements. Before Lewis could answer, the bell above the door jingled as a customer entered. Ms. Sullivan glanced over, then back at Lewis with an apologetic smile. I should get that, she said, standing up. But I'd like to hear your answer, if you don't mind waiting a bit longer. Lewis nodded. I'm not going anywhere. As she walked away, Lewis realized he wasn't sure how to answer her question. Was he happy? After all the races, the titles, the fame, had he found what he was looking for? It was just like Ms. Sullivan to ask the one question he hadn't prepared for. Ms. Sullivan took longer with the customer than necessary, and Lewis suspected she was giving him time to think about her question. Was he happy? It seemed so simple, yet he rarely asked himself that. He watched as she carefully prepared a complicated coffee order, making small talk with the customer. Even after the revelation of who he was, she remained focused on the person in front of her. That was her gift, making each person feel important. When the customer left, Ms. Sullivan returned with fresh coffee for both of them. "Sorry about that," she said, sitting down again. "Now, where were we?" "You asked if I'm happy," Lewis reminded her. "Ah, yes. Too personal?" "No," Lewis shook his head. "Just complicated." Ms. Sullivan nodded patiently, waiting for him to continue. It reminded Lewis of how she would sit with him during reading time, never rushing him when he struggled with a difficult word. "I've achieved more than I ever dreamed possible," Lewis began. "But happiness, that comes and goes. Racing gives me purpose. Using my platform for causes I believe in gives me fulfillment. But happiness? I'm still working on that." "That's a very honest answer," she said. "Most people would just say yes." Lewis smiled. "You always could tell when I wasn't being truthful." "Teachers develop a sixth sense for that," she laughed. "Especially with students like you." "Students like me?" "The ones with fire inside them," she explained. "The ones who are going to do something extraordinary, even if they don't know it yet." Lewis raised an eyebrow. "You knew I'd become a Formula One driver?" "I knew you'd do something remarkable," she clarified. "The way you talked about racing. It was different from other children's interests. Most kids go through phases. Dinosaurs 1 month, space the next. But you had such focus, even at that age." "I drove my dad's friend around a racetrack when I was 6, Lewis told her. "Just sat on his lap and steered. My dad said I had a natural feel for it." "Anthony was so supportive," Ms. Sullivan recalled. "He came to every parent-teacher conference, even when I knew he was working multiple jobs. He'd show up looking exhausted but completely focused on you." "He sacrificed everything for my racing," Lewis said softly. "He believed in you fiercely," she agreed. "But you know what impressed me most? He listened to you. Many parents push their children toward the parents' own dreams, but Anthony could see yours was genuine." Lewis felt a lump in his throat. "Not everyone saw it that way. Some people thought he was pushing me too hard." "I remember," Ms. Sullivan nodded. "There were concerns raised, but I told the other teachers that I'd never seen a child light up the way you did when talking about racing. It wasn't your father's dream. It was yours." "It was," Lewis confirmed. "It still is." Ms. Sullivan sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "I've followed your career more than I let on, actually. Not the racing details. Those go over my head. But the headlines, the big moments. I saw when you broke records and won championships." "Really?" Lewis was surprised after her earlier comments. "Of course. When a student of mine makes history, I pay attention." She smiled warmly. "I was especially proud when you began speaking out about racial justice and diversity in your sport. That took courage." Lewis felt a wave of gratitude. "Thank you. Not everyone supported that. Standing up for what's right rarely wins popularity contests," she said matter-of-factly. "But it's what gives life meaning." Ms. Sullivan reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. She tapped on it a few times, then turned it to show Lewis a photo. It was a newspaper clipping about Lewis's first championship in 2008. "I cut this out when you won your first title," she explained. "I showed it to my classes for years afterward. This young man sat right where you're sitting," I'd tell them. He struggled with reading, but he never gave up. Lewis stared at the clipping, touched that she had kept it all these years. I used your story often, especially with children who had learning difficulties, she continued, not to pressure them to become champions, but to show them that their current struggles wouldn't define their future. I hope it helped them, Lewis said sincerely. It did. I had one boy, about 10 years ago, who refused to try reading aloud because of his stutter. After I told him about you, he started practicing. Last I heard, he's studying speech therapy at university, planning to help other children. Lewis felt a strange sense of pride, knowing his story had helped others in ways he never imagined. There was a girl, too, Ms. Sullivan continued, warming to her subject. Terrible dyslexia, worse than yours even. She'd cry every time we had spelling tests. I showed her articles about you, and do you know what she said? Lewis shook his head. She said, "If Lewis Hamilton can drive that fast, maybe my brain just works fast, too." Ms. Sullivan laughed. "She's a software developer now?" "That's amazing," Lewis said, genuinely moved. "You never know the impact you have on others," she said. "As a teacher, I learned that early. Small words of encouragement can change someone's entire path. Like when you told me my dyslexia could be a strength," Lewis said. "Exactly." She nodded. "Though I never imagined the ripple effect it would have." Lewis thought about the millions of fans who followed him, the children who wore his merchandise, the young drivers who cited him as their inspiration. The ripple effect, indeed. "My son Daniel nearly fell off his chair when I told him you'd been in our shop," Ms. Sullivan said, changing the subject slightly. "He made me swear to get your autograph when you return." "I'll do better than that," Lewis promised. "I'll get him paddock passes for Silverstone next month." Ms. Sullivan's eyes widened. He would absolutely lose his mind. "Consider it done." Lewis smiled. "It's the least I can do for the son of the teacher who helped make it all possible." "That's very kind, but you're giving me too much credit," she protested. "Your success is your own doing, Lewis. I just helped you see what was already inside you." "That's what the best teachers do," Lewis said. "They hold up a mirror that shows you not just who you are, but who you could become." Ms. Sullivan looked at him with pride that had nothing to do with his fame or success. "You know," she said softly, "of all the students I taught over 30 years, you're one of the few I always wondered about. Not just if you'd succeed, I knew you would, but if you'd be okay, if you'd find your way." "And what do you think?" Lewis asked. "Have I found my way?" Ms. Sullivan studied him carefully before answering. "I think you're still finding it," she said finally. "And that's exactly as it should be." "I think you're still finding it," she said finally. "And that's exactly as it should be." Lewis smiled, feeling a weight lift that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. Ms. Sullivan's simple acceptance of his journey, completed achievements and unfinished growth alike, felt like permission to be both successful and still searching. "Thank you for that," he said quietly. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the bustle of the coffee shop continuing around them. Lewis was about to ask about her own journey from classroom to coffee shop when he noticed a young woman at a nearby table staring at him with wide eyes. She was nudging her friend and pointing discreetly in his direction. Lewis had seen that look thousands of times. Recognition was spreading through the shop like ripples in a pond. The young woman stood up nervously and approached their table. "Excuse me," she said, her voice quivering slightly. "Are you Lewis Hamilton?" Before he could answer, the girl's friend had joined her, phone already in hand. "Oh my God, it is! Lewis, can we get a photo, please?" Ms. Sullivan watched with surprise. As Lewis shifted seamlessly into public figure mode, his posture straightening and a practiced smile appearing on his face. "Of course," he said kindly, standing up. The first photo turned into several as other customers realized who was in their midst. The quiet coffee shop suddenly buzzed with excitement. People who had been minding their own business were now pulling out phones, whispering to each other, and edging closer to Lewis's table. "It's really him!" someone said loudly. "Lewis Hamilton, in Stevenage, in this coffee shop. Can you sign my napkin? My son will never believe this." Lewis handled each request with grace, posing for photos and signing whatever was handed to him. But he kept glancing back at Ms. Sullivan, who was watching the scene unfold with an expression of dawning realization. This was his daily reality. The constant recognition, the endless requests, the way his presence changed the energy of any space he entered. Finally, after signing a paper cup for an excited barista, Lewis made his way back to the table. "Sorry about that," he said to Ms. Sullivan. "This happens sometimes." She shook her head in amazement. "I had no idea. I knew you were famous, of course, but seeing it..." She gestured to the still buzzing shop. "It's like watching a nature documentary suddenly come to life in your living room." Lewis laughed at the comparison. "That's actually a good description." "Does this happen everywhere you go?" she asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. "Pretty much," Lewis admitted. "It's why I don't get out much when I'm home. Usually I have security with me. But I wanted to be normal yesterday." Ms. Sullivan looked thoughtful. "It must be exhausting." "It can be," Lewis agreed, "but it's part of the job." The shop door opened, and 3 more people rushed in, phones ready. Word was spreading beyond the coffee shop now. Lewis noticed Ms. Sullivan's expression shift as the crowd around them grew. The warm, personal connection they'd been sharing was becoming impossible to maintain as his public persona took over the space. "Would you like to step into the back office?" she offered, seeing his discomfort. "We could continue our conversation in private." "That would be great," Lewis said gratefully. Ms. Sullivan stood up and addressed the gathering crowd with the same firm but kind tone she'd used to control excited children in her classroom. "Everyone, please. Mr. Hamilton has been kind enough to take photos, but he deserves some privacy too. Please enjoy your coffee and give him some space." To Lewis's surprise, people actually listened, backing away slightly and returning to their tables, though the excited chatter continued. Ms. Sullivan led him behind the counter toward a door marked Private. As they walked, Lewis noticed her. Hands were trembling slightly. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. "Just processing," she admitted. 24 hours ago, you were a former student I vaguely remembered. Now you're..." She gestured vaguely at the commotion behind them. "Still that same student," Lewis assured her, "just with a slightly more complicated life." She smiled at that, but Lewis could see the shift in her perception. The ease of their earlier conversation had been replaced by a new awareness of the eagerness gulf between their worlds. As Ms. Sullivan opened the office door, her phone rang. She checked the screen and her eyes widened. "It's Daniel, my son. Someone must have told him you're here." Lewis saw the conflict on her face. The teacher, who wanted to continue their meaningful conversation, versus the mother who knew how much this would mean to her son. "Answer it," Lewis encouraged. "Tell him I'm looking forward to meeting him." As Ms. Sullivan took the call, excitedly confirming to her son that yes, Lewis Hamilton was really in her coffee shop, Lewis felt their worlds shifting again, realigning into something new and undefined. Dr. Ms. Sullivan's small office was nothing like the sleek, sponsor-branded spaces Lewis was used to. A simple desk was stacked with coffee shop paperwork and supplier catalogs. The walls held framed photos of what must be her family, along with a few children's drawings labeled to Ms. Sullivan in wobbly handwriting, gifts from former students that she had kept all these years. "Daniel is absolutely beside himself," she said, ending the call. "He's trying to get an earlier flight home." "When was he supposed to return?" Lewis asked. "Day after tomorrow. He's at a racing engineering conference in Birmingham." "What kind of engineering does he do?" Ms. Sullivan's eyes lit up at the chance to talk about her son. "He works with a Formula 3 team, designs brake systems. He's brilliant with math. Always was. Gets that from his father." Lewis nodded with genuine interest. F3 is a great place to develop skills. Many of the best F1 engineers start there. That's his dream. Formula 1. He applied to several teams but hasn't broken through yet. Lewis made a mental note to talk to Toto about potential openings at Mercedes. If Daniel was half as dedicated as his mother, he'd be an asset to any team. A knock at the office door interrupted them. One of the young baristas peeked in. "I'm so sorry, Miss Sullivan, but there's a line out the door now. People are saying Lewis Hamilton is here. Some aren't even buying anything, just coming in to look." Ms. Sullivan sighed. "I'll be right there." When the barista left, she turned to Lewis with an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry about this. It seems our quiet conversation has turned into quite an event." "I'm the one who should apologize," Lewis said. "I've disrupted your business." "Disrupted?" she laughed. "We're selling more coffee in 1 hour than we usually do all day, but it's not very peaceful for you." Lewis shrugged. "I'm used to it, but I don't want to make things difficult for you. Perhaps we could continue this another time, when the excitement has died down," she suggested. "I'd like that," Lewis agreed, "but I leave tomorrow. I have testing at the factory before Austria." Ms. Sullivan looked disappointed. "So soon?" "The Formula 1 calendar doesn't leave much room for breaks," Lewis explained. "But I'll be back for the British Grand Prix next month." "Hattie, Silverstone," she nodded. "Daniel goes every year." "With paddock passes this time," Lewis reminded her, her eyes crinkled with happiness. "He'll be so thrilled. Thank you for that." Another knock at the door, more urgent this time. "Ms. Sullivan? There are some people with cameras outside now." Lewis groaned. Word was spreading faster than he'd expected. Soon there would be proper photographers and possibly TV crews. His peaceful visit to Stevenage was definitely over. "I should go," he said, standing up. "This will only get more intense." "Wait," Ms. Sullivan said, a hint of her teacher authority stopping him. "Use our back door. It leads to the alley behind the shops. You can avoid the crowd." Lewis smiled gratefully. "Always looking out for your students." "Old habits," she admitted. She led him through a small storage room to a metal door. Before opening it, she turned to face him. "I'm glad you stopped for coffee yesterday, Lewis. Truly." "So am I," he said sincerely. "It's been grounding. Talking with you brings back who I was before all this." He gestured vaguely to indicate the commotion in the shop. "You're still that person," she said firmly. "All the success, the fame, those are things that happen to you, but they're not who you are." It was such a Ms. Sullivan thing to say, cutting through the noise to what mattered. Lewis felt a sudden urge to hug her, and after a moment's hesitation, he did. She seemed surprised, but returned the embrace warmly. "You know," Lewis said, as they separated, "in all my interviews, people always ask about my racing heroes. Senna, Schumacher, Prost. But they never ask about the other people who made a difference. The ones who help you become who you need to be." She nodded with understanding. "Exactly." Lewis pulled out his phone. "Could I get your number? I'd like to stay in touch, if that's okay." "Of course," she said, reciting her number as he entered it into his contacts. "I'll call about the Silverstone passes," he promised, as she opened the back door. "Louis," she said before he stepped out, "I meant what I said earlier, about still finding your way. That's not a criticism. The journey is what matters most." Louis nodded, feeling a deep appreciation for this woman who had shaped his early years and was somehow unexpectedly touching his present as well. "Thank you, Ms. Sullivan, for everything." "Margaret," she corrected with a smile. "And you're very welcome, Sir Louis." That made him laugh as he slipped out into the alley, the sounds of the crowd fading behind him. That made him laugh as he slipped out into the alley, the sounds of the crowd fading behind him. Louis walked quickly, keeping his head down. The narrow passage between buildings soon opened onto a quiet side street. He pulled his cap lower and headed toward home, his mind replaying the conversation with Ms. Sullivan. "Margaret," he corrected himself. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Everything okay? Someone just called asking if Lewis Hamilton is really in Stevenage." Louis smiled and typed back, "All good. Cover blown at the coffee shop. Heading home now." The walk gave him time to think. Meeting Ms. Sullivan after all these years had stirred up memories and feelings he hadn't examined in a long time. As a Formula One driver, Louis was always focused on the next race, the next challenge, the next championship. Looking backward wasn't part of the winning mindset. But now, fragments of his childhood came rushing back. Sitting in Ms. Sullivan's classroom, struggling to read while the letters jumped around on the page. The frustration of knowing he was smart, but not being able to prove it on tests. The shame of being called stupid by other kids. And then Ms. Sullivan, with her patient voice and kind eyes, showing him a different way to see himself. Louis was so lost in thought that he almost missed the turn to his mother's street. As he approached the house, he saw a familiar car parked outside. His father had come over. "There he is," Anthony Hamilton called from the porch as Louis walked up. "The man who shut down Stevenage with a coffee run." Louis grinned and bounded up the steps to hug his father. "Word travels fast. Your mother got 6 phone calls in the last hour," Anthony laughed. "One from that reporter at the local paper who's been trying to interview you for years." Inside, Louis's mother was making tea in the kitchen. "So, how was Margaret?" she asked. "Did she recognize you right away?" "That's the craziest part," Louis said, shaking his head. "She didn't connect me to the famous Lewis Hamilton at all. Not until today." Louis told his parents about the 2 conversations with Ms. Sullivan, how she'd remembered him as a student, but hadn't realized he was the Lewis Hamilton that her son idolized. "That sounds like Margaret," Anthony nodded. "She never paid attention to sports or celebrities. For her, it was always about the children. She kept her pear tree pin all these years," Louis said, "and she used my story to motivate other kids with learning difficulties." Anthony's expression grew serious. "We owe her a lot. You know, she was the first teacher who really understood you, who saw past the dyslexia to what you could become." "I know," Louis agreed. "I told her that." "What did she say?" his mother asked. "She said she was just doing her job." Louis smiled at the memory. But we all know it was more than that. They moved to the living room with their tea. On the mantelpiece were photos from Louis's career, his first podium, championship celebrations, receiving his knighthood from the Prince of Wales. A life that seemed impossible for the struggling reader from Pear Tree Junior School. "Did you know she kept newspaper clippings about me?" Louis asked his parents. "She showed her students that I'd sat in the same classroom they were sitting in." "That doesn't surprise me," Anthony said. Margaret always believed in the power of example. Remember how she'd tell stories about famous people who overcame challenges? Lewis nodded. She mentioned Einstein and Richard Branson to me when I was upset about a spelling test. And now she uses you as the example, his mother said softly. Full circle. Lewis felt a lump form in his throat. I never thought about the impact I might have on kids like me. I'm so focused on racing, on winning. That's as it should be, Anthony assured him. You can't be thinking about being a role model when you're fighting for position at 200 miles per hour. But it matters, Lewis insisted, knowing that kids with dyslexia see me and think, if he can do it, maybe I can too. His father nodded with understanding, just like you felt when Ms. Sullivan told you about Einstein. Exactly. Lewis stared at his championship trophies in the photos. They suddenly seemed to hold new meaning. I invited her and her son to Silverstone next month, Lewis told his parents. Paddock passes, the full experience. Daniel will lose his mind, Anthony laughed. That boy has followed your career religiously. Used to send me emails with race analysis when you were at McLaren. Really? Lewis was surprised. Margaret said he works in Formula 3 now. Engineering. Smart lad, Anthony nodded. Gets that from his mother. Lewis's phone rang. Toto again. He glanced at his father apologetically. Go on, take it, Anthony encouraged. We know the drill. As Lewis stepped into the hallway to answer, he heard his parents discussing how proud they were of him. Not just of the championships and the records, but of the man he had become. Lewis? Toto's voice came through. We need to finalize the schedule for tomorrow's testing. I'll be there, Lewis assured him. And Toto? I want to talk to you about a potential engineering candidate for the team, son of someone important. To me, currently in F3. Of course, Toto agreed, sounding intrigued. Anyone you recommend deserves consideration. After ending the call, Lewis rejoined his parents. The conversation shifted to family matters, race strategies forgotten for now, but Lewis's mind kept returning to Victory Lane and the teacher who had helped set him on his path. He made a silent promise to himself. After the season ended, he would find a way to properly thank Ms. Sullivan for the gift she had given him all those years ago. 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Lewis left Stevenage the day after his conversation with Ms. Sullivan, diving straight into testing at the Mercedes factory in Brackley. From there, it was on to Austria for the race. Weekend. The familiar rhythm of practice sessions, qualifying, and race day consumed his attention. But in quiet moments, sitting in his hotel room, waiting in the garage while mechanics worked on his car, his thoughts kept returning to Victory Lane and the teacher who had made such an impact on his life. Lewis had texted Margaret a few times, simple messages to maintain the connection. She had replied with the same warmth and directness he remembered from his childhood, sending him a photo of the coffee shop's new chalk sign, home of Lewis Hamilton's favorite coffee. It made him smile every time he thought about it. Now, with the British Grand Prix at Silverstone just days away, Lewis was in his apartment in London, on the phone with Margaret about the promised paddock passes. Daniel is so excited he can hardly speak, she told him, laughter in her voice. He's watched every interview you've done since Austria, analyzing your comments about the car. Has he? Lewis grinned. What's his conclusion? He thinks you're downplaying the car's performance to throw off Red Bull. Lewis laughed. Your son is perceptive. Too perceptive sometimes. He's already asking if he can bring his resume. He absolutely should, Lewis said seriously. I've mentioned him to Toto. No promises, but we're always looking for talent. There was a pause on the line. That's incredibly kind, Lewis, but Daniel wants to earn his way on merit. And he will, Lewis assured her. A conversation is just a foot in the door. His skills will do the rest. After confirming the details for Silverstone, Lewis hesitated. There was something else he wanted to discuss, an idea that had been forming since their meeting. "Margaret, there's something I'd like to talk to you about. Something important." "That sounds serious," she replied. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," Lewis assured her. "Better than fine, actually. Our conversations got me thinking about my foundation work." Lewis had established a charitable foundation several years ago, focusing on supporting underprivileged youth. But recently, he'd been considering a new direction. "I'm planning to expand the foundation's focus," he explained, "to include specifics, programs for children with dyslexia and other learning differences, especially those from disadvantaged backgrounds." "That sounds wonderful," Margaret said warmly. "Here's the thing," Lewis continued. "I need someone who truly understands how to reach these kids. Someone with experience, compassion, and knowledge of what works in education." There was a brief silence as Margaret realized what he was suggesting. "Lewis," she said carefully, "are you offering me a job?" "More like a partnership," Lewis clarified. "I have the resources and the platform. You have the expertise and the heart. Together, we could create something special." I'm not sure what to say," Margaret stammered, clearly caught off guard. "You don't need to answer now," Lewis assured her. "Just think about it. We could start small, consulting on program development, reviewing educational materials." "What about Victory Lane?" she asked. "The coffee shop is my retirement project." Lewis hadn't considered that. Of course, she wouldn't want to abandon her business. "We could work around that," he suggested. "Part-time involvement, flexible schedule, whatever works for you." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "It's a lot to take in," she finally said. "I'm honored you'd think of me, but I need time to consider it." "Take all the time you need," Lewis said. "No pressure at all." "Thank you." Her voice softened. "You know, watching you race on television, reading about your championships, I've always been proud. But learning about your foundation work, seeing how you want to help children facing the same challenges you did, that makes me even prouder." Lewis felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. Coming from Ms. Sullivan, this praise meant more than any podium celebration. "I learned from the best," he said simply. They finished the call with Lewis promising to meet them at Silverstone's entrance on race day. After hanging up, he stood by the window of his London apartment, looking out at the city skyline. Had he pushed too hard? Margaret seemed overwhelmed by the offer. Perhaps it was too much, too soon. The last thing he wanted was to pressure her, or disrupt the life she had built. Lewis's phone buzzed with a calendar alert. Team strategy meeting in 30 minutes. The racing world was calling him back. As he gathered his things to leave, Lewis wondered how Margaret would respond to his offer. Would she join his foundation efforts or choose to remain focused on her coffee shop? Either way, he was grateful that their paths had crossed again after all these years. Some connections, Lewis was learning, were meant to last a lifetime, even when the road between meetings was long and winding. Some connections, Lewis was learning, were meant to last a lifetime, even when the road between meetings was long and winding. The British Grand Prix weekend arrived with its usual blend of excitement and pressure. Racing at Silverstone was always special for Lewis. This was home soil, where he had won more times than any other driver in history. The British fans covered the grandstands in Union Jacks and Mercedes flags, cheering his name during the drivers' parade. But this year felt different, more personal. Because somewhere in that crowd of 140,000 people were Margaret Sullivan and her son Daniel, watching him not just as fans, but as connections to his past and, possibly, his future. Lewis had arranged for them to have the full VIP experience: paddock passes, garage tour, access to the Mercedes hospitality area. He'd even asked Toto to meet with Daniel, just an informal chat about engineering opportunities without making any promises. After final practice on Saturday, Lewis found Margaret and Daniel waiting in the Mercedes hospitality suite. Daniel, a man in his early 30s with his mother's kind eyes and an excited expression, looked like he was trying very hard to maintain professional composure and failing completely. "Lewis!" Margaret greeted him warmly. "That was quite impressive out there." "Thanks," Lewis said, giving her a quick hug before turning to her son. "You must be Daniel. I've heard a lot about you." Daniel shook Lewis's hand with barely contained excitement. I've followed your career since your GP2 days. The move you made at Istanbul Park in 2006 was just..." He made a swooping gesture with his hand. Lewis laughed. "That was a good one. Your mom tells me you're working with Carlin in F3? Daniel nodded eagerly. "Brake systems engineering, but I'm hoping to move up to F2 next season." "And then F1? Lewis asked. "That's the dream," Daniel admitted. "Always has been." Lewis nodded thoughtfully. "Mine too. Since I was about your height." He held his hand at waist level. Margaret watched their exchange with a smile. "Daniel used to sleep with a toy version of your McLaren under his pillow. I had to wash it when he wasn't looking." "Mom!" Daniel protested, his professional facade cracking completely. Lewis grinned. "No need to be embarrassed. That's what racing is all about. Passion. The technical skills matter, but it's the love of the sport that gets you through the tough days." They spent the next hour talking. Daniel asked insightful questions about the car's performance, showing a deep understanding of Formula One engineering. Lewis was impressed. Margaret's son clearly had inherited her intelligence and her ability to see beyond the surface of things. Eventually, Lewis had to leave for a team meeting. "Toto's expecting you in about 30 minutes, he told Daniel. "Just be yourself. He appreciates straightforward people." When Daniel excused himself to use the restroom before his meeting, Lewis found himself alone with Margaret for the first time that day. "This means the world to him," she said quietly. "Meeting you, seeing the garage, talking to Toto Wolff. Whatever happens, thank you for that." "He's impressive," Lewis said sincerely. "Smart, passionate, good technical knowledge. Those are qualities any team would value." Margaret nodded proudly before changing the subject. "I've been thinking about your offer." Lewis felt a flutter of anticipation. "And I'm interested," she said carefully. "Very interested. But I have concerns about Victory Lane. It's not just a business to me. It's a community." "I understand that," Lewis assured her. "The last thing I want is to pull you away from something meaningful." "What if..." Margaret hesitated. "What if we could combine them somehow? Use the coffee shop as a model for a program that helps young people with learning differences develop workplace skills." Lewis's eyes widened. This wasn't what he had expected, but it was brilliant. Like a training center disguised as a coffee shop? Exactly. Margaret's eyes lit up. A place where kids can learn practical skills in a supportive environment. "We could start with one location and see how it goes." "Margaret," Lewis said slowly, "that's genius. It addresses exactly what these kids need. Real-world experience with proper support." She smiled, pleased by his reaction. "I'm still working out the details, but I wanted to see if the general concept appealed to you." "It more than appeals," Lewis assured her. "It's exactly the kind of innovative thinking the Foundation needs. Daniel returned, nervous energy radiating from him as he prepared to meet Toto. Lewis gave him an encouraging pat on the shoulder. Just remember, everyone in Formula One started somewhere, even Toto. As Lewis watched Daniel walk toward his potential future, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. His chance meeting with Ms. Sullivan had already set new possibilities in motion. "Are you happy, Lewis?" Margaret asked suddenly, echoing her question from the coffee shop. This time, Lewis didn't hesitate. In this moment, absolutely, and he meant it. Here, bridging his past and future with people who saw him for who he truly was, Lewis Hamilton felt something better than happiness. He felt purpose. 2 weeks later, Lewis was preparing for the British Grand Prix. The weather at Silverstone was typically English. Sunshine 1 minute, threatening clouds the next. But Lewis hardly noticed. His mind was focused on the race ahead, the most important of the season for him personally. "Lewis, 5 minutes until the interview," his press officer reminded him as he sat in the Mercedes motorhome, reviewing data from the morning practice session. "Thanks," Lewis nodded, closing the laptop. Pre-race interviews were routine, but today's felt different. He had something personal to share. The Sky Sports reporter greeted him with a handshake as cameras were adjusted and microphones checked. "Thanks for making time, Lewis. There's a lot of buzz about your pace this morning." "Happy to be here," Lewis replied, settling into the chair. "Silverstone always brings out the best in us." The interview began with standard questions about tire, compounds, track temperatures, and strategies for the afternoon qualifying session. Lewis answered automatically, his mind partly elsewhere until the reporter changed direction. "You seem especially focused this weekend, Lewis. More centered than we've seen you in a while. Is there something different about this race for you?" Lewis smiled, recognizing his opening. "Actually, yes. Something pretty amazing happened a few weeks ago. I reconnected with someone important from my past." The reporter leaned forward, sensing a story. "Someone from your racing career?" "From before that," Lewis clarified. "My primary school teacher, Ms. Sullivan, she was the teacher who helped me with my dyslexia when I was 8 years old." "That's quite a throwback," the reporter commented. "How did this reunion happen?" Lewis described walking into Victory Lane coffee shop in Stevenage, finding his former teacher behind the counter, and her not recognizing him initially. He kept some details private, the personal conversations, the emotions, but shared enough to convey the significance. "She was one of the first people who made me believe my brain worked differently, not wrongly," Lewis explained. "That perspective changed everything for me." "That's powerful," the reporter nodded. "Has reconnecting with her influenced your approach to this weekend?" "It's reminded me of why I started racing in the first place," Lewis said. "The pure love of it, before championships and contracts. But it's also inspired something new." Lewis hadn't planned to announce this yet, but the moment felt right. "I'm launching a new initiative through my foundation," he revealed, "working with educators like Ms. Sullivan to create programs specifically for children with dyslexia and other learning differences, especially from disadvantaged backgrounds." The reporter's eyebrows raised. "That sounds like a personal mission." "It is," Lewis confirmed. "These kids need to know their different way of thinking can be a strength, not a weakness. They need practical support, but also examples of what's possible." "Well, you're certainly a powerful example," the reporter acknowledged. "Will we be seeing Ms. Sullivan at the track this weekend?" Lewis smiled. "She'll be here with her son tomorrow. He's actually an engineer in Formula 3, working his way up the motorsport ladder." "Full circle moments all around," the reporter noted. "Well, Lewis, best of luck in qualifying. Sounds like you've got extra motivation this weekend." After the interview wrapped, Lewis headed back to the garage. The team was making final adjustments before qualifying, the atmosphere focused and purposeful. "Good interview," Toto commented as Lewis passed through. "Personal, but positive. PR team is happy." "Thanks," Lewis replied. "Felt right to share that. Story here." "About Ms. Sullivan's son," Toto added, lowering his voice. Technical director was impressed with his brake cooling concepts. "We're discussing a development role." Lewis tried to contain his smile. "That's great news. He's earned it." "Of course," Toto agreed. "His mother's connection to you opened the door. But his ideas are what interested us." Qualifying went better than Lewis had dared hope. Despite challenging wind conditions, he secured pole position with a lap that left his competitors nearly 3/10 behind. As he returned to Parc Fermé, the team erupted in cheers. "Brilliant lap, Lewis," his race engineer's voice crackled through the radio. "Absolutely brilliant." Lewis pulled his car to a stop and climbed out, pumping his fist toward the cheering British fans. The energy was electric, the support overwhelming. Later, in the quiet of his driver room, Lewis checked his phone. Among the congratulatory messages was one from an unknown number. When he opened it, he found a photo of a coffee cup with "Victory Lane" printed on it, sitting beside a small, worn toy race car. A McLaren from the early 1990s, the paint chipped from years of handling. The message read, "Still have this from when you left it in my classroom. Time to pass it back to its rightful owner. Drive like the champion I always knew you'd be." Lewis stared at the image, emotion welling in his chest. He didn't remember leaving a toy car in Ms. Sullivan's classroom. Had she kept it all these years, waiting for this moment? He typed a quick reply. "Thank you. This means more than you know. See you tomorrow." As Lewis prepared for bed that night, he felt a rare sense of peace. Tomorrow's race was important. They all were in a tight championship battle. But somehow, the weight of expectation felt lighter. Whether he won or lost, he was driving with purpose that extended beyond trophies and points. He was driving to show every child with dyslexia what was possible. And that, Lewis realized, might be his most important championship yet. And that, Lewis realized, might be his most important championship yet. Race day at Silverstone dawned clear and bright. The grandstands filled early, a sea of British flags waving in the summer breeze. For Lewis, the pre-race routine was familiar. Team briefing, warm-up exercises, quiet moments of visualization. But today, his mind kept returning to the photo Margaret had sent. That small toy car, kept for decades, symbolized a belief in him that predated his success. In the garage, final preparations were underway on his Mercedes. Lewis checked his phone one last time before handing it to his assistant. A new message had arrived from Margaret. "Daniel and I are in the Mercedes area. Your team has been incredibly kind. Good luck today, though I suspect you make your own luck." Lewis smiled. That sounded exactly like something Ms. Sullivan would have said to him as a child. No empty encouragement, just a steady belief in his ability to shape his own destiny. The race itself was one Lewis would remember for years to come. Starting from pole, he lost the lead briefly after a slow pit stop put him behind Verstappen. For 15 laps, Lewis hunted the Red Bull driver, looking for any opening. "Tires are good, Lewis," came his race engineer's voice over the radio. "You're faster. Take your time." Lewis felt an unusual clarity as he drove. No anxiety, no frustration about the botched pit stop. Just focused determination. When his opportunity came, Verstappen sliding slightly wide at Stowe Corner, Lewis pounced, executing a perfect overtake on the inside. From there, he controlled the race with precision, crossing the finish line 5 seconds ahead of his rival. The crowd erupted as Lewis took the checkered flag, British fans celebrating their home hero's victory. "Get in there, Lewis, his race," engineer shouted through the radio. "Fantastic drive, absolutely fantastic." Lewis's victory lap was emotional, one hand on the steering wheel, the other waving to the cheering fans. As he passed the main grandstand, he could almost imagine 8-year-old Lewis watching from the stands with his father, dreaming of this very moment. The podium ceremony followed the familiar routine: the trophies, the anthems, the champagne. But during his post-race interview, Lewis surprised everyone. "This win is special," he began, still catching his breath. "I'd like to dedicate it to someone who believed in me long before I had trophies or titles. My primary school teacher, Ms. Sullivan." The interviewer looked intrigued. "The teacher you mentioned yesterday? She's here today?" "She is," Lewis confirmed, scanning the crowd below the podium. "And I want to announce something important. Together, we're launching a new initiative to support children with dyslexia and other learning differences." Lewis explained the concept. Briefly, educational programs combined with real-world training opportunities, starting with a pilot project in Stevenage. Every child deserves to have someone who believes in their potential, who helps them see their differences as strengths, Lewis concluded. "I was lucky enough to have Ms. Sullivan. Now we want to create that support for many more children." Television cameras panned to the Mercedes guest area, where Margaret stood with Daniel, her expression a mixture of pride and amazement as the crowd applauded. Later, after media obligations and team celebrations, Lewis found Margaret and Daniel waiting in the Mercedes hospitality area. Daniel was buzzing with excitement, having just finished a tour of the team's engineering center. "Incredible race, Lewis," Daniel exclaimed. "That move at Stowe was perfectly executed." "Thanks," Lewis smiled. "I hear you impressed our technical team." Daniel looked like he might burst. "They've offered me a position, junior development role, starting after the summer break." "Congratulations," Lewis said sincerely, shaking Daniel's hand. "You've earned it." When Daniel stepped away to take a phone call, Lewis turned to Margaret. "That was quite an announcement," she said, her eyes twinkling. "You put me on the spot." "Sorry about that," Lewis grinned. "Got caught up in the moment." "It's fine," she assured him. "I'm all in, already thinking about how to make this work." Lewis nodded gratefully, then lowered his voice. "About that toy car you sent a photo of?" "Ah, yes," Margaret smiled. "Brought it with me today, actually." She reached into her bag and pulled out the small McLaren. Its red and white paint faded with age. Lewis took it carefully, turning it over in his hands. "It's strange, but I don't remember leaving this in your classroom." Margaret's eyes held his for a long moment. "That's because you didn't," she said softly. "Not exactly." Lewis looked confused. "But you said—" "I know what I said," Margaret interrupted gently. "But the truth is a bit different. The real story is even better. And someday, I'll tell you all about it." Before Lewis could press further, they were joined by Toto and other team members, the moment for private conversation gone. As Lewis posed for photos with fans, signed autographs, and celebrated with his team, one question kept returning to his mind. What was the real story behind that toy car? And why had Margaret kept it all these years? 6 months after Lewis's victory at Silverstone, Victory Lane Coffee had transformed. The small shop in Stevenage had become something of a pilgrimage site for racing fans. They came from across Britain and beyond, hoping to sit at the table, where Lewis Hamilton had rediscovered his primary school teacher. Margaret still worked behind the counter a few days each week, though her schedule was busier now. The rest of her time was devoted to developing the educational programs for Lewis's foundation. The pilot project, a training cafe for young people with learning differences, was set to open in 3 months. Lewis visited whenever he was, in England, always sitting at the same corner table. Today was one of those visits, a rare quiet afternoon in the off-season. The shop was closed to the public, giving Lewis and Margaret privacy to discuss foundation business. "The curriculum looks excellent," Lewis said, reviewing the materials Margaret had prepared. "I love how you've integrated practical skills with academic support." "That's the key," Margaret nodded. "These children need to see the real-world application of what they're learning, just like you did with racing magazines." Lewis smiled at the memory. Their professional relationship had evolved naturally over the past months. Margaret brought educational expertise, while Lewis provided resources and visibility. Together, they were creating something neither could have accomplished alone. "I've been meaning to ask you something," Lewis said, carefully placing the toy McLaren on the table between them. He'd kept it with him since Silverstone, often holding it before races as a sort of talisman. "You never explained the real story behind this." Margaret's eyes softened as she looked at the toy car. The Victory Lane walls now featured photos of their reunion and Lewis's Silverstone win alongside the racing memorabilia. "It felt like the right time to return it," she said, touching the car gently. "But you're right. There's more to the story." Lewis waited as Margaret collected her thoughts. "The truth is," she began, "this wasn't your car at all. You did have a similar one. All the boys racing mad boys did. But yours was lost during a particularly difficult day at school." Lewis frowned, trying to remember. "You'd failed a spelling test," Margaret continued. "The other children had been unkind. You were upset and left your toy car on the playground. By the time I found it, someone had stepped on it, broken it beyond repair." "I think I remember that," Lewis said slowly. "I was devastated about that car." Margaret nodded. "You were. Your father had given it to you after your first karting win. I felt terrible about it. So that weekend, I went to every toy shop in Stevenage until I found an identical one." "You bought me a replacement?" Lewis was surprised. "I did. I planned to give it to you on Monday, say I'd found it. But when you came to school, you were so excited about a real race your father had taken you to see that you never mentioned the lost car. It didn't seem important anymore." "So you kept it," Lewis realized. "I did," Margaret admitted. "At first, I thought I'd give it to you eventually. Then, as years passed, it became a sort of reminder. Of you, of course, but also of all the children with dreams bigger than their circumstances." Lewis shook his head in wonder. "And you kept it all these years?" "I did," Margaret smiled. "I always had a feeling our paths would cross again someday." "That's why you weren't surprised when I walked into your coffee shop," Lewis realized. "On some level, you were expecting me." "Perhaps," she conceded. "Not consciously. But I've always believed that certain connections are meant to last." Lewis picked up the toy car, seeing it with new eyes. It wasn't just a childhood memento, it was evidence of Margaret's belief in him, long before he'd become Sir Lewis Hamilton. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." "No need for thanks," Margaret replied. "Just keep proving me right about you." Lewis smiled, placing the car carefully back on the table between them. "I'll do my best." As they returned to discussing foundation plans, Lewis felt a deep sense of contentment. His chance stop for coffee had led to reconnection with his past, new purpose for his future, and the discovery that sometimes the most important people in our lives are those who believed in us before we believed in ourselves. The toy car sat. Between them, not just a symbol of Lewis's journey from struggling student to world champion, but of the hidden threads that connect our past to our present. And sometimes, if we're very fortunate, lead us exactly where we need to go. Thanks for joining me till the end. Let me know in the comments from where you are tuning in. Drop your city and country name in the comments. Also, make sure to subscribe to this channel if you love Lewis Hamilton. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed this heartwarming story of friendship and second chances. See you in the next one.